In summer of 2017, I requested the Supreme Court of Texas apply certain codes associated with providing an audit of the Texas Economic Development Bank, as well as any projects requiring a defense or readjustment allocation to the state of Texas, and also a specific means by which people in the United States, or specifically in Texas actually, could be availed of information and how their social security number had been used in any sort of public financing or in any sort of activity involving a intercession with state entities, so that they could then be engaged in a process that was supposed to be provided to them in how they can access the means by which to use their own intangible property and or abstract property to their own advantage to provide for their means. That was not responded to by the state. What I've learned since then is that in 2017, at that time, there was actually a 10-year anniversary on specific programs that had been implemented and approved by the Texas legislature specific to defense readjustment projects that would have also involved intercession with the Texas Economic Development Bank. I did not know this at the time. Nobody apprised me of this. This is something I've come into awareness of recently. But since that time, I have done a number of things and understand that a number of means exist here in Texas for an appropriate response, including one that could potentially coordinate with or through the Office of the Attorney General and or with or through the Office of the Governor in order to address local possibilities that are already constitutionally accessible and were already constitutionally accessible by September 1st of 2017. One of the things that could happen is that understanding that sheriffs most of them on a monthly basis have auctions of real property that has been seized as part of foreclosure proceedings, which means that the sheriff's department is responsible for and has an inventory of actual real property that could potentially be made available as necessary, including hopefully in a process where they coordinate with local matters or local entities responsible for any sort of health or safety inspection, and or including processes whereby they could acquire permits, and if necessary via inculcation of or invocation of certain codes in the state of Texas, can actually get assistance from the state to authorize bonds to pay for any rents on those properties as necessary. Not all of the means available have to require one to accept designation as a military asset or as a defense asset during that time frame. There are processes, however, that are constitutionally authorized already in the state that make it available to issue bonds on behalf of a political subdivision or an entity that is authorized by the legislature in order to provide temporary or as needed housing to people where the rent is paid for by the state. Now, when those rents are paid for by the state, there's a variety of things that can be done with that. There's a variety of ways that can be accounted for that do not necessarily have to, and hopefully would actually not, encroach upon the constitutional rights and the rights to protections of the people that would be involved in those matters. And by virtue of intercessing with the sheriff's department in such a capacity, there could also be a means of sort of accountability and also provision of protection as needed, including if we're talking about people that are in a situation where they are fleeing violence or they are in need of some assistance in order to protect themselves from a threat of violence. This is something that is available in every county in the state of Texas right now. And so there's that consideration in terms of the actual financing. This is something that could be done by the appropriate political subdivisions and could also take into account the specific needs of the community based upon the assets available at the time. So this is one means that can be applied. I've also, in the course of the last several years, come up 3 different times of comprehensive mass transportation of people plans, mostly involving air travel, mostly involving private air travel, and a means by which legally one can contact a provider of air carrier services in order to have them made available to provide civilian flights, including for an emergency or humanitarian purpose. One time in early 2019, I did this in consideration of what had already been identified by me as potential recoveries from certain banks and financial institutions in regards to what had been publicly posted, but what had also not been publicly posted at the time as being compensation or remuneration they owed as part of fees or payments for getting busted for fraud, and how that could have been budgeted in order to actually address the cost of air travel in a way that would not obligate the state or draw on any public resources, but rather would have been a specific kind of expense that would have been accommodated by virtue of a restitution owed. based upon acts of fraud by banks and financial institutions of concern. So this was one process that was available early 2019. It was not availed of. In the late summer of 2018, there was another process that was available through federal appropriations that would have required some sort of emergency or humanitarian assistance designation that would have intersected with or through the Department of Defense. Again, this was not acted on at the time. It was not followed through. There was another process that could potentially have been available in early April through mid-April of 2020 that I had also come up with specific to transportation, including transportation of people in matters where they might have a need for humanitarian assistance on a large scale, and the understanding that there are places that they could have been housed temporarily that would have taken them out of a context of being used for some other kind of political gamesmanship, but would have provided safety and potentially even a means by which they could have been engaged in legitimate processes to get their actual needs met. In the course of this, one of these plans did involve accessing the base reallocation and closure commission inventory of facilities, including decommissioned military facilities that might have usable housing from the decommissioned military facility, and or would have housing facilities that with appropriate inspections and with appropriate renovations could be made habitable, including for a a long-term but temporary period of time while things were processed, that would not require some kind of tent situation and would not be akin to being institutionalized in some sort of penal setting. All of these things have constitutional basis in law, including laws of the state of Texas, which has been the primary basis by which to evaluate these matters so far. All of them could have already been made available and implemented by now. And I contend that at key points, if these sort of processes had been engaged, there would have been a disincentivization to the kind of politicization that is occurring right now, especially in response to so-called refugee crises. But this is also understand this is not just about people that are foreign born. These are the kinds of resources that were necessary and needed within the United States itself, at least for the last 4 years. It would have allowed for a means by which an emergency call-up could be performed, and some sort of readiness could be asserted in order to get needs met, including for a large-scale number of people, without having to warehouse them into questionable contexts that make commercial interests a priority to them actually getting their needs met, and hence end up exacerbating the politicization of these kinds of circumstances in those regards. So all of these things could have been available at any time. They could have already been available by tonight. There was another process in early February, late February 2020, where based upon recoveries and based upon a very large scale situation at the time, that had I been acknowledged, and for instance, if I had been involved in the role of an attorney general that was actually busting crime and actually recovering what had been defrauded of the state, there would have been enough money to have made a purchase within a short period of time and actually have mortgage and deed entitle made available, including, if necessary, to private entities that would be conservators or would be the actual stewards of the land for several ranch facilities that were up for sale at the time in the state of Texas. All of those could have already been made available for the declaration of the state of emergency concerning COVID-19. And there were a variety of matters that could have been engaged on site at those ranches by now that would have had them and the people there prepared for being able to engage in a variety and number of tasks, all of which were necessary this whole time, and all of which could have already been provided.